Thanks, Bernie. Kia ora koutou. Welcome to the 7th Cheers conversation for the Engineering New Zealand Transportation Group and our third one for 2022. I am Bridget Thorin. I'm in the middle of a 2-year position as chair of the group, and my mission as chair continues to be an exploration of why we don't get better outcomes from transport. So all of our national and local government visions and most of our policies say pretty good things about what we want from investment. We want happy, healthy, safe, livable places and a survivable planet, ideally, which are rather uncontroversial things by themselves, and well over 80% of our engaged members want us to do more on climate change specifically. We know that because we asked them. But somewhere between that vision and the street surface, we get some pretty sad, unhealthy, unsafe, unpleasant solutions, and the projections for the planet are not looking very survivable if you're a human with an interest in future generations. So these conversations exist to uncover why that mess exists and what we could do about it as a group of professionals. And over the last 6 conversations, I'm concluding that we don't get better outcomes because we're facing hard systemic challenges that we don't understand well enough to adapt to more quickly. But I think there is hope because the world is starting to realise that planetary challenges won't wait around for us to decide whether we can justify responding to them, and the climate is literally changing before our eyes. So we have governments starting to create things like emissions reductions plans, starting to use language that is increasingly urgent. We have communities increasingly wanting government to make that action and to take it seriously. And recently, and this will be a theme of today's conversation, our Climate Change Commission has said that the transport sector needs to reduce vehicle kilometres travelled from 2019 levels by 20% to 2035. And that is a huge change in approach, a paradigm shift actually in transport planning and in the engineering we'll have to do to get there. So that's where we are for today's conversation. As Bernie said, if you'd like to ask any questions or make any comments, please use the Q&A feature in your screen. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Jessica Brenton-Shaw. Jess is a public narrative researcher and advisor with a PhD in health psychology. In roles across government and the not-for-profit sectors, she has focused on placing best knowledge and equity at the heart of decision making. And as co-director of the workshop, Jess currently leads a team researching public mindsets that enable or prevent changes that make a big difference, and developing new narratives to improve decision-making with regard to our big social and environmental challenges. I know Jess has long had an interest in transport and in getting better outcomes from transport, so I'm delighted. Welcome, Jess. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Bridget.
So we'll start just with a bit of your background, your perspective of why you think transportation group members might be interested in what you do and why you're interested in transport.
Well, why am I interested in transport? I think because transport is fundamental to so much of our lives and our experiences, right? The minute you start to realise that, I think as somebody interested in change like I am, you see transport as this source of well-being, I guess. And so for me, that's why I'm particularly interested in transport, because I think there's real opportunities there to create some of those better outcomes for that better world that you talked about a little bit earlier. I'm a transport user. I walk, I ride my bike, I drive a car, I live in the city, and my children also do. And I can see how much potential there is, I think, for transport to be better for them and better for lots of, especially children. I think for me, look, I'm a bit of I'm an omnivore, I guess, in terms of a researcher. I'm a social scientist really by background. Always really interested in evidence primarily. I guess I have always seen myself as a person who is a bridge between good science and the implementation of that. And I've done that in different settings and in different ways. And in my current role at the workshop, what I'm really interested in is how can we use language and narratives, especially the way we talk, the way we frame, to be a bridge between good evidence, science, and the implementation of that, especially in policy, but not primarily in policy. So I guess I'm a bridge builder in the way that lots of people in engineering are as well. So yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Bridge is a great word. I like to own it myself, actually. But what you just said, oh gosh, we're going to need a long time, but about yourself being a transport user. Transport's such a tangible thing to people. And I wonder if transport and perhaps food are the most useful ways to talk with the public about climate change kinds of things, because they're so obvious and they're repeated and they're in people's, they can make individual little choices all the time that they feel might make a difference. But there's also structural, systemic frameworks around those choices that affect what people have. So do you think perhaps that's quite exciting thing for transport? We can be at the forefront of public conversations on something like climate change because it's so real and constant.
Yeah, it's such a good point, because like in a lot of the work that we do is we're involved in sort of how do we help people communicate and talk about big changes in a way that people understand it. And one of the challenges we have is that often in the issues that we're dealing with and we're helping people on is that they tend to be relatively abstract. They're quite big, they're quite complex. They're often systems issues, which, as we know, systems are complex with lots of interacting parts. So when we're having conversations with people in the public, especially, the ability to grasp onto those things is quite difficult. And climate change is a classic example of that. I mean, I think we who work in this space make a lot of assumptions about what people understand about climate change. And what I would say is people just haven't been given information in the right kinds of ways to really understand what climate change is and how it impacts them and what can be done about it. So I think on that, like something concrete like transport, and how transport can be a mechanism for helping us address climate change is actually, has real potential. And as you say, I think especially from a thinking about how does the transport system shape, I guess, our response to climate. What I would say is that I think while the opportunity is there, people still have relatively little understanding of the relationship between transport and climate.
Yeah, sure. I think, we all live in bubbles, and we have our professional understanding, and then the attitudes and experiences and perceptions of people we know who don't work in transport, which are really variable as well. And then the broader public beyond that, who aren't even in our social circles. I think we can perhaps forget that those links between transport and climate change are not as well understood by everybody. So what do you think? You mentioned work you've done in terms of how we tell that story. What have you worked on recently in terms of like something like mode shift, specifically about the language that we should use and connecting that back to people's values?
Yeah, so maybe if I start a few steps back from why the words and narratives matter in terms of people's understanding and their ability to support kind of big changes. So as you mentioned, my background originally was in health psychology, and the type of work that we do now in narratives, what we call kind of strategic narratives, it's a really omnivorous area of research which draws on psychology, cognitive linguistics, framing, public health. So we come, and a lot of other social sciences as well, anthropology. So we draw together a lot of these areas, and primarily because those of us who work in this space have come to see that how people think and reason, so not just what their attitudes are or what their opinion on an issue, but how they think and reason about issues are very big determinants of whether they think that there's a problem in the world, what solutions that you're offering, and whether they think that they are useful and usable solutions to them, and how willing they are to engage with a conversation with you around the science of them. And mindsets are really these kind of shared understandings that we have, which reflect this how we think. But the really important place where narratives come into that is that mindsets are shifted, or I guess moved or brought to the surface by how we talk, the language we use and the frames, the messages, the metaphors that we use. So communication is everywhere. We do it all the time, every day, spoken and unspoken. It's our primary mechanism of relating and connecting to other people. And it's through this communication that you can actually think about the types of mindsets that you bring, or you help people bring into a conversation about, for example, transport and climate change. So our research that we've been doing, especially in the mode shift space, has been firstly about understanding how do people think and reason about transport, and some really fascinating things, some which will be not at all surprising to you, and some which might be a little bit surprising. And then what are the kind of narratives, the words, the languages, the frames that we can use to help people, I guess, when they're having a conversation about transport and climate, or transport and mode shift, what are some of the words and languages we can use to bring more helpful mindsets to, therefore, how can we help people think and reason in ways that will get them to a place where they can think more positively about the types of changes that we want to make.
So could you give us maybe an example of that? What's something
Totally.
what's something that's surprising about how people think about transport, and then what's an example of a good way to talk to them about it?
Well, I think a couple of things which I'll start with the not surprising, because in a way that's easiest. That's the water we're swimming in often. So there's a few mindsets that people have about transport, and this won't be a surprise to you, Bridget, is people primarily think of transport in terms of cars and roads. It's very hard for people to reason outside of cars and roads in terms of transport when you say that word. They also tend to think in quite individualistic ways about transport, and this sort of carries on from that, where if we think about cars, roads, trucks, vehicles being the kind of default of transport, then anything outside of that is often seen as kind of an individual choice which people make to diverge from the norm. And in that way of thinking, if something bad happens to people in that space, if they're not protected, if it's difficult for them, then that's because they've made a choice to do that. And so there's a kind of a way of reasoning in which people think, well, we shouldn't invest in protecting those people or supporting those people or doing things because they're choosing to be outside of the norm of how everybody else travels. And that way of thinking and reasoning, when you hit that with people, is incredibly difficult to have a conversation about shifting our transport system or thinking about different ways of doing transport, investing in cycle infrastructure, for example. Very hard to have that conversation when people think in that way. But there are other ways and more helpful ways that we find that people can think about transport, though they're not very well exercised. I'll be really honest with you. Like, you have to dig quite deep down in conversation with people about them. But people do think about the ways in which our cities are designed can be more or less inclusive to people, that they can be a physical environment that makes it really hard for example, children to get around, for disabled people to get around. So they can think differently. And in fact, we found that when we talk, especially about how we can create cities in which they are more open to people who are disabled, to children moving around more freely, then it really brings to the surface different types of mindsets for people and starts them thinking differently about some of the options and solutions.
Yeah, that's really cool, because I find that when I'm talking with people about work on for disabled people and their transport experiences, nobody wants someone to have a bad time. Nobody, most people are quite compassionate when you talk about that kind of level, but it's almost like it's a different part of their head from how they understand transport for themselves, and that they should drive everywhere because they're normal. In fact, in transport engineering, when I was learning about it at undergraduate level, we used to talk about public transport being inferior modes. That's how it was described in textbooks, like inferior modes. And I think about that sometimes. We've kind of duped people into thinking that this first class luxury car travel thing that we can do very easily in Timaru or Te Kaupara or somewhere is also something that should be their right to do in Auckland and Wellington. And if there's not enough space, we should build more space.
Yeah, well, it's very hard. If it's very hard for people to think and reason about other ways and means, and this is how mindsets work, they shape what we see as normal. And we see this as very normal, right? And we see this, and there's almost a kind of a fatalistic and kind of naturalistic kind of way of thinking about the way in which we've constructed our transport system, when we know the reality is that that's just a series of decisions and choices that have been made over time by a series of policymakers and planners, for example. So there is partly a need to kind of undo some of that thinking in which this stuff is set in stone, natural, just the way things are, to get people to understand that we can actually reshape these systems. And that's well within our means to reshape some of our systems to do things away from cars. And one of the things we found in our message testing is that if you give people a good origin story, so if you can tell them about why a thing happened in the first place, that can really help. We often spend a lot of time describing a problem to people. And I would say, especially in transport, we spend a huge amount of time describing problems, transport problems, or describing solutions to people. And look, if you're not really that engaged in the conversation to start with, like you're not like us and you're total nerds about this, then, you know, a description doesn't really give you it doesn't give you a new story. If you've got a whole lot of assumptions about the kind of the way that our cities are designed are just natural and what's best, then if you're not giving them a new story, and this is an explanation essentially, then it's hard for people to understand why we would do things differently. And so one of the things we found is that if you can talk in really simple ways about the construction of cities, specifically during periods where we had lower populations, where we thought that cars would, you know, be fine. We constructed our cities really around movement of cars, and now our cities have changed and our population has changed, and it's making it difficult for everyone. And so we need to rethink from a pragmatic point of view how we construct our cities, especially people can reason quite differently when you give them a good origin story for where our problems are coming from. And interestingly, we didn't test messages, because we do message testing to see how we can get people to reason differently about things. We didn't do anything around climate. But what we did find is that people are much more willing to consider mode shift if you talk to them about things like population growth and the kind of original intent around cities and needing to change that. So you can actually achieve, you know, changes in outcomes for people to think differently about things like mode shift, which might have a climate benefit without even necessarily mentioning the climate. I think there are important origin stories to tell about climate and emissions as well. But I think what that shows us is that you can give people some of your little origin story and some of that kind of good explanation, and they will shift their thinking into a space where they're more willing to hear solutions.
Right, so it's kind of like stepping them outside of their own little personal bubble into this kind of, well, if we were playing SimCity, I always talk about SimCity, it's because my audience appreciate that. We wouldn't have designed it like this for these constraints. So we had these inputs at the time, and this is how we built it, and that is what it is. But as an origin story, something that goes back but also looks forward to say, well, totally. New Zealand's growing and we're going to have really big populations, and we don't necessarily want them to sprawl all over our beautiful countryside. So we're going to need to think a bit differently about how we can move people around efficiently in that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you mentioned values earlier, and one of the things is, if you're heading towards a very specific solution, if there's a very specific solution that you want to give people, and especially if, you know, as excuse me, as you and I work in, where we're particularly interested in, and I guess in its most basic term, public good. So what is the most good for kind of the collective, both now and over the long term, then it can really help by opening those conversations with that type of frame as well, a value around public good, or a value around the collective well-being, or a value around what's working for, you know, for particular groups of people, what's not working for other groups. So as much as the origin story can really, I guess, place people within a particular frame of thinking about what the role of transport and transport planning might be, which is not about individuals, and it's absolutely about public good, and especially about long-term public good, then you can lead and step people through into a solution which matches that kind of frame which you've given them.
Right, so that's for the public, and that's kind of for the comms people that we might have involved in our projects and policies and engagement. But what about within the transport sector itself? We don't talk a lot about public good in engineering school. We talk about networks and efficiency and road safety and walking and cycling as if they're their own little, you know, single merged together word over on the side. And engineering is really all about process and constraints and product and output. And so we have transport engineering born from the same mold, where the constraints are road space and your material is traffic. And so that's what you work with. When you were talking about public good, I was thinking, how would that affect the way that we plan a street upgrade. You know, we even call it that. We go straight to the transport language. We don't talk about community enhancement or well-being or vibrancy even, or vitality. We talk about the infrastructure straight off the bat. That's the way that our investment is framed at the moment. We're either maintaining something or operating something or improving the capacity of something. So do you think there's a big shift that needs to happen, even maybe in terms of how multidisciplinary our transport investment is, maybe, because the moment we have a transportation department, then it feels compelled to deliver transport, right? Whereas the traditional outcome for that what we need actually might be quite different from a traditional transport solution.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. And I think you and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, which is I think we're at a point in time when for a lot of industries and professionals and a lot of people who I work with, you know, the types of changes that we're required to make in response to some pretty big challenges, especially climate change, actually requires more than just tweaks around existing policies and systems. It actually requires that we're rethinking the assumptions which are driving a lot of the work that we do. And this reminds me very much of conversations I have with economists as well, which is that actually changing the types of outcomes that we're interested in, or improving them or addressing them, certainly is going to require that we rethink some of the assumptions underpinning a lot of the things that we're teaching people. And I was just listening to you talk about transport and engineering being about efficiency. You know, that in itself is a very powerful set of values, which says that the most important thing, and the thing or the paradigm which underpins a lot of the work that we're doing, is about growth, wealth, money, right? And I would argue that we're at a time when that is really being challenged. We're being challenged to reset some of those paradigms that underpin a lot of our systems. And I think that's a struggle, because sometimes we haven't named that specifically. Sometimes we've been asked to change policies, practices, regulations, processes. And what's not being named is that the assumptions underneath it are needing to change as well. And so, for example, in the environmental space, there are conversations going on about, do we need to reset the values by which we are in relationship with the environment with, or can we just fix climate change by carbon trading our way out of it? So these are live conversations, right? And so it doesn't surprise me that they're there in transport and engineering as well.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, but like I was saying earlier, it's a huge opportunity as well. So when I was a graduate, literally 20 years ago, we used to have books on the shelf with the traffic volumes of all the state highways in them going back for decades. And when we're deciding or we're doing an economic analysis, benefit cost ratio calculation for a new rural passing lane, for example, we look up those charts and work out what the traffic growth rate is, and traffic always grows. That was an explicit assumption. People would, you know, teach me traffic always grows. It will always grow. So usually it's our default value is around 3% per year. So you put that in your calculation and work out the savings if people are going 105 k's an hour, which you used to do. I don't know if they still assume that people are breaking the limit to calculate these travel time savings. And then you extrapolate that out 30 years into the future and work out how many vehicles per day are going to be benefiting, therefore, from this increased or this reduced travel time. So if we're going to have a reduction in traffic as a goal of the sector, I don't even know if that makes sense to use the same model. It's not like we can just put the numbers in and then claim a benefit in the other way. Like, what is our benefit then if it's not if it's fewer cars? It just kind of throws a bomb into the way that we work in the way that we've assumed benefit. So maybe it has to go back a step again and to bring in I don't know, the economists, or is it not even economists anymore? Is it just a whole different kind of world where we have kind of some kind of values-based priority setting that doesn't rely so much on that financial benefit cost ratio because we're not sure how to do it anymore? Or do we have time to bring in new formulae that makes sense. I don't know. It seems so far away from what we do now. I'm not sure how we would even begin to go about.
Yeah. So I think it is true, and lots of our work, we get to a place where people start to question the underlying assumptions and the paradigms which sit underneath the work that they do, and that can be pretty big and scary. But I think that is increasingly conversations that are going on internationally. But dialing it kind of to a more manageable bite size, not lying awake at night at 3 a.m. thinking, oh my goodness, how I'm going to change my entire profession, is in that space where you're talking about, which is value conversations, which is like for all of you, no matter who we are and what our profession is, most of us have sets of values about the types of things that we care about and that are important to us. And a lot of those things look the same in the sense that we care about taking care of people in our community. We care about the environment. We care about doing things well, creatively, making pragmatic decisions for the long term. These are all the types of core kind of collective and intrinsic values, the things that really drive us. And social psychologists say consistently the world over, these are the things which people prioritize. And I think the first place to start having conversations within our professions is, what are the things that really matter to us as people? Why are we not working in this way? And in a sense, those are conversations that can start up some discomfort, some level of discomfort, but they're also quite freeing conversations in some ways, and they can lead to conversations about, this stuff isn't making me happy, or I don't feel like we're doing the right stuff for our communities, and how might we be able to change it? So I'd certainly think a good place to start is, what do we think the stuff is that matters, and how might we make shifts in the way we're doing things? And maybe there's small shifts to start with. Maybe we're thinking about, in economics, for example, there's a movement to rethink about how economics is taught. And, these are all things which, once you start having a conversation, is, what do we really value? What matters most to us? What are our whys as human beings together? Then it's easier to start having those more pragmatic conversations. So what does this mean for my profession? What does this mean for the way that we're doing things? How might we be agents of change within our own professions to start that conversation going?
Yeah, cool. So you're talking, this reminded me that you were talking earlier about how a lot of people see transport as car and driving their car places, and that people who choose not to do that, for example, who choose to walk or bike for transport reasons, are putting themselves out there at their own risk, and they can suffer the consequences of that. But do you think there's an opportunity? I've often thought about whether some of that transport stuff should be funded, or at least related to policy for health and recreation and exercise, because a lot of people do those things. I'm sure they value going for a run, going for a bike ride, especially since lockdowns and it was literally almost the only thing you could do. But going for a walk around the block hasn't got any value in a transport sense, but it's obviously got huge value to people as humans. So maybe that's part of our reframing, that we bring in health and well-being a lot more into our the way that we think about what infrastructure we're providing, and to use that to change the way that we invest, perhaps. Yeah,
absolutely. Like, these are all, these are lived realities for people, right? Is that the ability to live in a neighborhood or a community in which it's really easy to walk around, where your children will be safe, elderly people in your neighborhood will be safe, where you can go for a run, where you can connect with nature. These are all true, real things which we feel, and it's all possible for us to shape a transport system to get those outcomes if we prioritize those types of things over, for example, the flow of traffic. I always talk about the road at the end of my street, which is Constable Street in Newtown, if anybody knows it, and it's a downhill run with a set of lights, and I am in deep relationship with the council over the speed of the light change there, because there are multiple children who cross that road every day to get to school, to the Newtown school, and people constantly run a red light, and there are often accidents on it. Now, it hasn't been prioritised that we stop people running those red lights. The following of the rules and regulations hasn't been prioritised. The children's wellbeing hasn't prioritised. families and parents' well-being in order to let their children move around independently hasn't been prioritised. What's been prioritised is the flow of traffic in order to get to the now somewhat congested end of start of Newtown. But that's a set of assumptions that are driving that, right? That what matters more here is the fast flow of traffic over the well-being and independence of families in our communities. Now, if you sat down and said to people, do you really think that matters more? Like in your life, do you really feel like these are the things that matters? For many people, most people, they would probably say no. So I think having those conversations and really digging down into the assumptions which are driving some of those decisions can show them up for being things that we don't really value that much. They're how we've ended up. We've just what we've ended up with, and we can reshape that.
Yeah, so that's come up in several examples that I can think of where we've had projects that have proposed something that's better for walking and cycling at a really specific intersection level. And then in Hamilton, for example, we had a case that's been in the news about a roundabout with nice Dutch-style cycle lanes and raised pedestrian crossings and things. And then it literally went to a council meeting where the traffic modelling was presented and questions were asked about that. And then everybody got scared because there were projected queuing delays. And it's just the same as the Harbour Bridge example. The computer model says no. And there seems to me to be a fear amongst the councillors in this Hamilton case in that situation. And maybe that's where it comes to in Newtown as well, I don't know, but a fear of backlash from people who are voting, not the people who are living there, but the general voting public, that we're somehow penalising car drivers for some wishy-washy goals for the people who are out there putting themselves at risk anyway, and that's their own responsibility. And by the way, they don't pay road tax. So that still, it seems to me to be kind of a major sticking point at the moment in terms of where the rubber hits the road in the decision-making process. It's this model. And so because we've always modeled traffic and we've got very sophisticated looking model outputs that aren't necessarily true, but they're very pretty, we don't have anything similar or similarly precise to 3 decimal places for the well-being of children. So so I feel like there's a disconnect even between the transport people, professionals making these, like they're just doing what they've always done. I don't blame them, but we don't have comparable tools, so we need to either demote the modelling outputs to some extent, or to put them in a context where good modelers would put them in anyway, to say this is just one part of the decision-making stuff. Or we need different ways to talk about and value people's access to being able to walk to school in ways that can convince those elected members in the Hamilton case. I think there's just this huge power of maps of big red lines of forecast queues.
That is particularly compelling vision. And I think there's a couple of things, which is it's true and it's real that what people feel is that cars in some way offer them the most freedom, because they do, because that's the system that we've built. But people also know that cars are increasingly becoming a source of frustration for them, right? So they increasingly know that they can't go anywhere on a Saturday and take their kids to sports without sitting in a queue of traffic now, whereas maybe 10 years ago they might have. So they increasingly know that cars aren't really working for them. But thinking back to that mindset that I talk about, if you can't think of transport as anything except cars, then of course you're going to hold really hard to this idea that the solution therefore must lie in cars and roads, right? And so partly I think it is an issue of presenting and valuing alternative perspectives and ways of seeing the world, and getting again that people to understand that we are now at a point of making changes that will make a difference to them, but that it is actually going to involve opening our streets up to way more walking, cycling and public transport. And that, I think there is this part which is like, if you always listen to people who are opposed to change, you're always going to back away from change. So there's this big question about who are you listening to? And a lot of our work is there are large groups of people that we know, the majority of people who can move either way on this. they are not particularly wedded to the idea of roads, but they find the idea of not having an easy way to get somewhere quite alarming. And so they are easily swayed by a kind of more roads argument. And then there are groups of people who are with you and are already, yes, it's time for a change, where we need to do things differently. And somewhere in the middle is most of the people who are disengaged and don't want to get into a conversation about this and find themselves frightened off social media or whatever it is. And those people, what they need is a really compelling origin story. They need to believe that it's possible, that they can experience the world differently. There's a whole mixture of things. It's not just about narrative. Narrative's important, but experiential stuff is really important, like experiencing traveling through your city differently in an easier way is important for people, but also an acknowledgement that the change process can be tricky. And I think we kind of have to be real about the fact that we are, in order to induce more demand on cycling, public transport and walking, for example, that is actually going to involve not just carrot but stick.
Yep.
And we don't necessarily need to talk about the stick, and that's one of the things we talk about in the narrative. People get quite alarmed if you talk about shutting streets to cars and all sorts of things, but they do respond quite well to talking about us opening streets to other means. And the reason they get scared is because at the moment what they feel is that there just are no other options for them. So I think there's a big part of this which is around decision makers, policy makers, being brave enough to say we're going to create far more options for people. And that's partly, we're seeing a little bit of that go on now, but also that they're going to staff the agencies who are required to do this change with the types of people and capacities and skills who know how to move a community through change and know how to support them through change. And I think that's a big part of this, which is, yes, we're going to do this. Yes, it's going to be a little bit tricky, no worse than a lot of road building that we do, to be honest. The types of roadworks that people will put up with, quite significant. So it's no worse than that. But yes, there are going to be changes, and a big part of what I see is really important is don't just ask people in your existing agencies who have been for the last 20, 30 years built up a whole skill set around status quo ways of doing things. Don't suddenly turn around and ask them to do a whole lot of new stuff with a whole lot of new priorities, a whole new set of assumptions, and then get annoyed at them when they don't know how to do it and they back away from it. So there is this big part of like, what are we doing to really ensure that those capabilities that people in our public services do have to make change, what are we doing to make sure they're supported and that they can actually do it? Because that's just a recipe for a disaster if we say to them, well, not only do you have to make big changes, but you have to keep absolutely everyone in your community happy. And I see this all the time, especially in road safety, which is, we're going to lower speeds because we care about Vision Zero, and we're going to do mode shifting because we care about kids' independence. But by the way, you have to give us all of your social media data, which tells us that you're keeping everybody in the community happy while this change happens. It's like, that's just a hiding to nothing, frankly, and it's unfair on people. So I think there is this element of, how do you support people doing the work of change if you've recognised that that's what you're actually doing?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think there was some data out of the Innovating Streets projects over the last year that found that those with the most successful community engagement and communications teams were the most successful projects, where they're framed as transport projects and the comms people brought in, then not as likely to succeed because they're just on the back foot from the start.
Like if you immediately frame something as a transport project, then the type of reasoning that people are going for is, this is about cars and roads. You've immediately
I'm getting that now from what you said. It makes a lot of sense what you said. I mean, I'm the same. I talk to my family about transport. They'll think about cars, and it's almost like I just don't go there in my head because they don't get it. Well, like that's the whole point. So if they don't get it, that's the whole point. But I was interested in what you said about the experiential stuff. So people need narrative, but they also need to experience stuff. Maybe there's an opportunity, with lockdown and with people getting out on their bikes. And also in the last year, I was reading the other day that there was 6 times more e-bikes than electric cars sold in New Zealand or something like that. Electric bikes, I think, have a huge potential to help with this experiential stuff, because all you need to do is take them out on a river trail or a off-road path on the weekends to feel how joyful it is, and the more people are doing that, then the more we're going to see bikes on the street, and they're quite a kind of middle class ratepayer kind of vibe, aren't they? People getting on bikes, and kind of people who look like counsellors will ride them. This morning I rode to work, and I went through two roadwork sites where they were essentially what we would call modal filters. The road was blocked to everybody except walkers, people walking and people using bikes. So I didn't know that these detours were coming up. They weren't detours for me because on my bike I just kind of biked through and thought, well, that's interesting. The world has an end because the road's been chopped in two. And the more people experience it, I even passed a ute on the bridge. I love passing utes on my bike. It's just one of my favorite things. So yeah, what do you think is the role of e-bikes in particular? Because I'm quite excited about them, just because they seem to me to something that's going to appeal to the kind of middle managers and elected members who are kind of maybe on the fence about some of this stuff.
Yeah, it's super interesting, right? So if I think about our work around mindsets and transport individualism, I think one of the dangers if we just give people things like a behavioural solution, like choosing to ride a bike, and that's their sole experience, then they're not going to think differently about the kind of shifts to the transport system, so the structures of the system. So I think it's an and scenario for me. It's a how do you think about the experiential of, as you say, both riding an e-bike, but riding it past congested traffic in a protected cycle lane, like those two things? Or how do you give people the experience of getting their kids off to a sports or an after-school activity without worry about it because you've put in a temporary cycle lane or whatever? So it's a kind of, I think you have to, partly it's the experience where there's a structural or systems change, that it's related to the type of change that you want to make in the world. Yep. Because as we know, if people just see it as all about people choosing to ride their bikes, obviously we know that with scale, with more people riding bikes, then it becomes safer for people riding bikes, though there is that adjustment period when more people actually get hit because you've got, and I mean, I have to say that being person riding my bike through Newtown during the changes, the temporary changes in the infrastructure has been really scary, and it's sent people off into some pretty angry spaces and towards the kids as well. So there is a real need to think about how can we do this in a way where we're taking care of everybody in the community as things get more stressful on our roads. And I think there's some really good research around that it does get more stressful for a while, both for people driving cars. And it was when I drove that section that I saw how stressful it, like all the road markings have changed and there's blind spots and things. So there is just a real reality of let's give people an experience, but let's just be careful and do it carefully. And some of this is about investment, right? It's about saying we're dedicated towards this, we care about doing this well, and we're going to do it well. There is no option. And partly that's, again, about that original conversation. This stuff matters so much to us now. It's a non-starter. Like, we're not even going to be having a conversation about whether responding to climate change or whether doing mode shift or whether reducing our emissions is a thing we're going to do. We're going to do it, and we're going to do it through changes to our transport system. And then we're going to think about all of the ways that we can support people doing it through things like experiences. And I do think the tactical urbanism approach can be really useful. I mean, we'll see how things pan out in Wellington, obviously, but it can be very useful for the reason that it can give people that experiential approach of what does it feel like. Yeah.
Cool. We're going to answer some of these questions from the audience soon. So if anybody's got any questions or comments for Jess, please put them in the Q&A. But I just wanted to end with a question I haven't told you about in advance, which just occurred to me, which is, if you were going to advise councils and waka kotahi on how to change their investment approach in what we've traditionally called transport, like if we were going to have this paradigm shift where we want less traffic and more health and well-being and climate sustainability, they all have an annual plan process every year, and waka kotahi has its funding activity classes. Maybe they're going to shake them up, maybe not, but that's how they've operated for decades. Every year they put money in buckets that say transport things. How would you approach that conversation about investment? Would you recommend that they change that and start again and join up with other sectors, or could you do it within the current way that they divvy things up as transport things? Oh, that's a really complicated question.
It is a complicated, yeah. I think, again, it depends on what we see transport as. Do we see it as a means to its end, or do we see it a tool for our communities and the way that we want to live? And I think if you start looking at transport as a kind of tool to enable the type of lives that we want people to live, then you can probably start rethinking about how you might invest in transport differently. And that might look like, well, we want a survivable planet, and we want our kids to experience independence in their town. We want urban people, and especially young urban people, provincial people, to be able to get to where they need to go without necessarily having to drive a car every time. So I think for me, I think if you were to re-look at transport through a lens of what does it enable in our lives and what are those things that we value, then you'd probably find that the way the investment was laid out looked quite different. And, I think it leads to some pretty perverse incentives if we've got a bucket of money associated with building roads at a time when we're trying to reduce carbon emissions. I was thinking about road safety and the types of perverse incentives you can get in there if you're not accounting for other outcomes that matter. For example, why is road safety in Vision Zero not got an element bedded in and very clearly labelled in it about getting people out of cars? Yep. Why don't we have an element in Vision Zero which is about intercity travel outside of cars, for example? Yep. So those, I think once you start thinking about what can transport enable in people's lives and what are the outcomes that it can enable in better ways, then I think you stop being so attached to the idea that you have to spend X billion on roads or whatever.
Yeah. If I were doing it, just because I'm running this conversation.
And I'm sure you've thought about it a lot more than me, Bridget.
I think we'd have budgets to maintain the assets, so that can continue. We have asset maintenance, and then everything else is what I'd call discretionary, and you give that to communities. Start with almost a local board kind of sense of what does this community need to live a good life, and how does transport fit into that, rather than assuming that we're going to upgrade 28 intersections around Hamilton or whatever. Actually talk to that community about how it can get around in a healthy way and access what it needs for a good life. Anyway,
that's really interesting, because it's quite similar to things like local budgeting processes, which are a much more community involved decision-making process. And so I think that's a really interesting reflection that you can do transport planning in a participatory way with the communities who are actually using transport infrastructure, right?
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so we'll go through some of these questions. First one's from Stephen. From where we need to get to in terms of mode shift and emissions reduction that's possible for the sector, how much of the challenge is about behaviour change and how much is around building and adapting our current networks, i.e. spending lots of money? If the cycle networks are getting good patronage, is the snowball already in train? Well, I'll let you answer that.
It's really interesting. Behaviour change is a word that I hear a lot and it's talked about a lot, and it's something that I tend to kind of move people away from, because our behaviours are what we know from most of the public health and social science research is behaviour is primarily shaped by our environment and our context. So if, in a sense, that how much of this is about building structures and systems that enable people to shape their behaviour, then I think a large amount of it is that, because we certainly know when we ask people why they don't walk and cycle, for many people they'll do it because they don't feel safe and the infrastructure isn't there and it's not enabled and it's not the default choice. So very much from a public health perspective, I would say that we have to create the context for people to change their behaviours, give them options to do so. And that is a large amount of it. And that is about network. How does the network work for people to enable them to do things differently?
It's really surprises me still how people equate behaviour change with an individual decision. And here you've got, two of us essentially PhDs in psychology. We study human minds and say, don't try and change them. It's not the brain. Like concrete's far easier to shift than brains, but it persists in transport. And even in my interview with Nicole Rosie from Makakotaha, she said it's not just infrastructure, it's behaviour change. And I'm like, okay,
and she's right, you know, but
yeah.
But that depends on what your theory of change for how you change people's behaviour. And what we know, what the science says, is you change people's behaviours, not solely, but first and foremost, in the most ethical way, in the way that requires the least from people. You change it through changing the context and the systems which they live in.
Yeah.
Politically, that's the hardest, of course.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's effort and it's, Okay, question from Amir. Any suggestions in terms of how the societal issues can be framed from a different perspective? It seems certain issues are being framed as transport issues primarily. For instance, Auckland Light Rail was framed as a transport issue. This is a good question, which made it very difficult, if not impossible, to be reframed as a city building or lifestyle transformation that requires land use and transport integration. So the question is whether the issues can be framed from a different perspective. Some of what we call transport projects, maybe they shouldn't be called transport projects. We should.
Yeah, 100%. And if we think about it, some of these projects aren't being done because they're transport perspectives. They're projects they're done for different reasons. Yep. Two things about that. It can be quite hard if you have dominant kind of ways of thinking and dominant narratives. It is quite difficult to reframe, but it is certainly, that's the work that we do, which is like you can reframe and you have to have your mates along with you. Like reframing is very much, I often say it's not about busking alone, it's about joining a band if you want to reframe the issue. I think what we saw, for example, in that light rail, reframing that as a mechanism to ensure people in South Auckland actually had equitable access to their entire city, had real potential. You know, when the light rail people went out and talked to people who were currently living in a lot of the places where light rail was going to reach, you know, they talked about things like they can't go anywhere without driving a car. They can't even get like 300 meters in the other direction across the motorway without getting in a car. Some of the young people hadn't gone to the North Shore because they had no mechanism to get there and no money. So I think one of the things we see in our research is inclusion. You know, talking about transport through an inclusion frame is actually very powerful. The idea that people are currently being excluded from taking part in everyday activities, jobs, work, education, and transport is an enabler of that. Good transport anyway is an enabler for that.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier you're interested in what transport engineering needs to do to change the assumptions that drive it. And I think I've talked for a while now about trips not made, and talking about trips not made, and just the fact that there's a huge proportion of society who doesn't make trips because they're too hard, and those people aren't really reflected amongst the transport profession, because we're relatively privileged people who travel, you consume a lot of transport, have a lot of choices. So I think if we measured trips not made, which I've done, several people have done in surveys and in observational stuff, and that could really start to bring to light the disadvantage that's quite hidden at the moment, because if they're not out there, we're not counting them on the street, right? So
yeah, totally.
Yeah, massive. Okay, here's quite a specific question. What do you think a junior transport professional can do to help make action happen now? So what's your advice from someone starting out in the career as a transport professional?
Oh, I feel like, Bridget, you'd be better placed to answer that. I'm not quite sure what the life of a junior transport professional looks like.
I think my advice to anybody starting out in anything is just to stay curious. Because if you've joined this conversation, you must be curious about something that will drive your own passion, and then go and do some more study and stay engaged and ask good questions and find your people, and whatever you need to do to stay motivated. If you're an energetic person, then you'll find your path if you just keep asking good questions and find good people to talk to about it. I think I don't think you need to be more specific than that.
No, yeah, and I mean, look, I think if you're looking to make shifts in the space as well, you can't go wrong with asking, what is it that matters in this space, and who are we prioritizing, whose needs? Those are always good questions to ask. That's
funny. I was talking to a psychologist once. I was like, I wish there was more psychologists involved in transport planning, and he said, we'd just stand around all day saying, but why? Never actually get a road built or a cycleway built, but those people are important too, right? Because engineers are, it doesn't matter why, just build the thing. You need a bit of both, perhaps. So we'll end with this one, which is about what I was saying. I think it's about what I was saying about having discretionary budgets that go to communities and participatory planning. and this person says there's a very real possibility that if we hand over significant direction, some local residence areas will want more asphalt for their cars over and above all else, so wide new streets and roads. So, I mean, I know a bit about how to do participatory, community design, but could you speak a bit to that, about how you bring people with you to get good outcomes when they may not know the ingredients? But
yeah, and I think I think possibly why some of the reason why participatory design hasn't been embraced yet is because it is more timely, it is more expensive, it does require more preparation. You can't just put a bunch of people around. It's not jury service that way, in the sense that there are certain pieces of information people have to be conveyed, there's certain conversations. It's very much, I guess, similar to a citizen's jury, you might think about it. And there are kind of core issues like equity that would have to be considered. You would have probably drive to through the types of decision making. So it is very much a process as opposed to just an outcome. And that would, in most cases, you would hope that would lead to, I guess, better informed. And certainly what the research shows is that when you do things like that, people do reason and think differently in those kind of more generative spaces.
Absolutely. So it's process and series of engagement and workshops and community stuff. It's not like you give people a checklist. Do you want more space for cars or more space for bikes? Because and I've seen that kind of survey go out and used as rationale for whatever. So it takes more effort.
Stop asking the public what they want and start asking, how things should be done in ways that work for them, right?
Yeah, that's right. How they like the communities to be and what they'd like to access and those kinds of questions. Okay, cool. So that comes to the end of the questions, which is good because we're out of time. So just want to thank you very much, Jess, for joining me today. That was excellent. I'm going to be digesting that for a while, and perhaps we'll schedule another one because I think we've got a bit more to unpack there. But yeah, thanks very much, and thanks everybody for joining us. And you'll see this recording up on YouTube shortly, and we'll send an advertisement out for the next conversation in the series. Have a great day.